Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the next update in the Canadian Federal Election Prediction Series. So this week we have had a Nanos poll, we have an Ipsos poll, and a Ledger poll come out, and collectively they've led to a very interesting little quirky result here. So on a higher level, more broadly, all of these pollsters individually have recorded a poll over poll decrease in Liberal support and slight increase in Conservative support. And they're all 2 to 4 percentage point swing, depending on the poll. I think Ipsos was 4 and Ledger was 2 to give you the bounds. But as you see here, for the keen-eyed viewers, the Conservative number is 119, so it went down 1, and the Liberals went up 1 seat, which might seem weird to you if I'm telling you that the Liberals did worse in more recent polls than they did in previous polls. Now, the way a quirk like this can happen when you're doing statistics, and why you can't just look at things, aggregations, in isolation and say this is perfect, like, even if the election happened tomorrow, I would expect like 20 to 30 seats to be off my prediction here. So I could go into great details where I would think that would be, but that's not that relevant for this video. So what happened in these situations is there's about 10 pollsters that release regular polls in Canada that have a track record and a history, so you can verify if they're any good or not. Of these pollsters, for any individual party, you have a range. Some of the pollsters will poll, let's say NDP, like Abacus tends to poll NDP quite low, Ledger tends to poll NDP quite high, relatively speaking. That doesn't mean either pollster is necessarily skewing numbers on purpose. It depends on how they sample, how they control. So a classic example here, Ledger appears, I don't have all the raw data they have in the background, but what they publish appears to just be controlling for province, age group, and sex. Whereas Angus Reid also controls for education level and household income. So if you start putting other controls like this into your sampling, both Angus Reid and Ledger use online panels, so that makes it more comparable, but the exact composition of the online panel also skews it too, which is more of an X factor, kind of hard to assess. And the very nature of online panels tends to mean more minority party viewpoints get overrepresented, because generally speaking, partisans for smaller parties are more vocal. I'm going to rephrase this. Partisans for parties are more vocal, and smaller parties have a high proportion of partisan members to just generic members. So you look at like the Liberals or the Conservatives, for example, they probably have relatively same amount of partisan members as NDP or Bloc. And by partisan, I mean like very committed to that party, what it stands for, and what its aims are. But because the Conservatives and Liberals are the two mainstream parties and they're more centrist than the other ones, they also attract a lot of votes that are that are not partisan, and the quote unquote swing voters, because the ideologues or the partisan votes in a party, they can switch or vote around or vote somewhere else. Like a classic example is like an NDP partisan might vote for a Liberal in in a district that has zero chance of electing an NDP candidate, or vice versa. Though, depending on the district, it could be NDP supporter voting Conservative, depending on the exact situation. And before you doubt me, they do exist, because not all NDP voters are super left-wing. It depends on what, like, different parties are a different bag of things, which I'm gonna probably do a video at some point on that, but that's a future video. So to get back here, so all the pollsters have a spectrum on how they poll people, and it's consistent. As long as it's consistent on how they skew, it's fine because you can look at that as a polling aggregator and you can understand it. It's weird. The problem is for pollsters is when their skew is unaccessible. So you're like, what? Like every poll over poll is just wildly different. Those are where the problems arise. But in this context, the most three recent Ledger, Nanos, and Ipsos tend to poll the liberals on the higher side and the conservatives on the lower side. And because of recency bias in the model, because I mean, obviously this is recency bias because they're trying to track popular opinion, if the three most recent polls are skewed towards one party, not skewed, that's the wrong way to phrase it. That's implying that the pollsters are intentionally making the results wrong or overinflated. If those pollsters have a tendency to poll in a certain way, it's going to change the results a bit. And again, I'm going to emphasize there's nothing necessarily wrong with those pollsters. It's just an important thing to note. They can be observing a trend, but that trend could cause the overall model to go a different direction than the trend looks like. So in this case, the trend looks like the liberals are losing support and the conservatives are gaining support. But the artifact in the model is that the liberals are gaining seats and the conservatives are losing seats. This can happen because if you look at the end of January, there was several polls that came out that were relatively strong showings for the conservatives and constant showings for the liberals. The liberals have actually went down from that point, and the conservatives are probably around the same level they were. But again, which pollster polled most recently does have an effect. And I will. That's the wrong one. I will just switch this. Just give me a second. So, okay, we can look at this one for example. So this is Saskatchewan. You look at like mid-January to early February here, and you have 57, 60, 56, 51, 51, 49, 51, 61 for the conservatives. So a range of 49 to 61. And the liberals are ranging from 17 to 22. The most recent polls, liberals are ranging 19 to 22, and the conservatives from 42 to 50. Now, it could very well be the case that the conservatives are losing support in Saskatchewan. That's not impossible. But it could also be the case that since the pollsters who polled most recently tend to poll a lower support level for the conservatives and higher for the liberals, or I guess in the case of Saskatchewan, higher for the NDP than other pollsters, it looks like it's overvalued, or it looks like the conservatives are losing ground. That is possible. And it would not be shocking if that is true. Because if you look at some of these polls, like this one and this one, I'm excluding pollster names because some of these are Nanos polls that I don't want to reveal data for. And if I don't have the name, you can't know the data. And you also, yeah. So this column I is People's Party, and this column J is other. So in these cases, this 44 and this 42 for conservative kind of makes sense, or seem plausible. They seem like a plausible result because where did the conservatives lose their ground? They lost ground to competing parties eroding their right wing, the People's Party and Wexit. And the draw from this is basically, or the precipitating incident for this theoretical draw, because again, everything is theoretical until you actually have an election where people vote, is that Derek Sloan was booted from the party for, I'm going to editorialize for a second, kind of dumb reasons. But he was booted out from the Conservative Party. That was the caucus that was the parliamentary caucus decision. That happened. and in some polls, make it look like the Conservatives lost ground to parties on their right wing. Some of these other polls, like this guy and this guy, make it look like the Conservatives lost ground to the NDP. Not impossible. This one seems a little iffy to me. I'd be extremely surprised if in this day and age, 32% of Saskatchewan voted for NDP federally. I think it's actually implausibly high. I don't think there's been. I think it's been. Oh, I don't want to look into this too much because I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. But I'm pretty sure it's been several years. Sorry, like several elections since NDP formed that well in Saskatchewan. I think in the 90s or might have been the 80s. I'm not 100% on this, and I don't really want to look too hard into it, but I'll correct myself in the description or in a header comment if I'm drastically wrong. But I'm pretty sure it's been like 30 or 40 years since the NDP performed anywhere close to 32% in Saskatchewan. So I guess the point I'm making here is you got to be careful with how you interpret polling data, because you could get the very wrong conclusion from this. You could very well conclude that, the Liberals are gaining ground right now, when really all the data is showing the exact opposite, that they're clearly firmly losing ground. And actually, was looking at something on the side. The NDP performed relatively good in Saskatchewan in 2015, but I don't think the situations that led to that performance are replicatable in 2021, because that was largely an anti-Harper vote. Harper pissed off a lot of people, and they voted against the Conservatives. I really don't think we would see that today. I think if the Conservatives get a poor result, it's more likely one of these, where the People's Party and Wexit parties did quite well, not that the NDP or the Liberals did well. If that makes sense. So, there's not much changes that has actually happened. The only change happened is Liberals picked up a seat in Manitoba, because the interesting thing. So this is one actually interesting artifact. So Ipsos and Nanos and Ledger all had basically the same results, where the Conservatives are doing worse in Saskatchewan and Manitoba specifically, a bit better in BC, better in Quebec, and better in Ontario, and absolutely atrocious in the Maritimes. And actually, the Maritimes as being recently has been getting polled well over 50% Liberal, which, as a local here, is not totally surprising, but at the same time, very unlikely. I don't see a situation where the Liberals would get that many actual votes in an actual election. It's not so much that the people in Atlantic Canada are anti-Liberal per se. In fact, I think they're very pro-Liberal. I just don't think that the climate that has allowed super high results for the Liberals in the past is really here. Maybe it's not impossible. I wouldn't be entirely surprised, but I guess it would depend. The big depending factor there for some of these results that we're seeing in some of these sub polls is a matter of, struggling for words here. Does Trudeau get the vaccines sorted? Because if you look at all the polling coming out, the big thing that seems to be hitting Trudeau is the vaccine performance, because pretty much, I think, universally across everybody in the world, that's like the main thing right now. That's pretty much the only thing anyone cares about, like politically, is can you get the vaccines delivered quickly, safely, and distributed quickly and safely. And if you look at Ledger, you look at Ipsos, their polls are noting that there's very little confidence in the Liberals' plan. And if that continues going forward, lack of confidence continues, I would be very surprised if the Liberals outperformed 2019 anywhere. I think they could very well get 2019 results. In the current climate, I think it'd be very unlikely for the Liberals to get less than 33 unless they completely miss their end of March vaccine targets. Because if they miss that, I think you're just going to immediately see a non-confidence vote in the government. Because you're having the budget come out, which has unprecedented amounts of money spent, and there's a lot of questions on how useful a lot of the spending has been, and there's been obviously this vaccine stuff, and if the vaccine deadline, I think the target Trudeau set publicly was 3 million doses, or is it 3 million vaccinations? I don't recall exactly which, because there's a slight difference. 3 million dosages with most vaccines is only 1.5 million vaccinations. So that's the main thing in play here. So we just go into these raw numbers here, just to wrap up the video. So if we look 2 week over week, I forgot to put in numbers for Feb 14 in here, and I'm too late. I mean, it's not impossible for me to recompute those numbers backwards. It's actually pretty trivial. I just don't have the effort because it doesn't really. That's not going to skew this graph that much. But 2 week update here. The Liberals have rebounded everywhere across the Atlantic Canada. Conservatives down a little bit, NDP down a little bit, Green down a little bit. People's Party gained a tiny bit, but other went down a bit. Really, no surprise. Conservatives seem to still be waffling around 18.5 to 19 range. Doesn't seem to be really gaining much support. The Liberals continue to lose a tiny amount of support. They seem to be on a downward trajectory in Quebec, but not super heavy. NDP picked up some slack. That Bloc seems to be alternating around. Not much surprise here. Ontario, pretty much the same story. Looks like the Liberals are tending downwards a bit. But I will note, even back in January, 41.7 was recorded in Ontario. So it could just be fluctuations week over week, or update over update. So it might not actually be a real loss of support. The Conservatives look like they look like they've lost support since the start of the year. They're clearly going down in Ontario. And conversely, the People's Party is clearly gaining some ground in Ontario. Coincidence? Probably not. Same story in Manitoba. Same story in Saskatchewan. Same story in Alberta. The Conservative parties lost support. People's Party has gained support in every area. Other has notably gained a lot of support, especially in Alberta, about 0.9, which is quite significant. Liberals seem to be just kind of floating around their even point. They might have gained some ground in Saskatchewan, but kind of hard to say. It appears they gained ground in Manitoba. They're clearly still losing some ground in BC. Conservatives don't seem to be gaining the ground. That's the general synopsis going on right now. We look at graphs. Liberals still seem to be losing ground, clearly, in my this really, really messy graph. This appears to be outlier. This appears to be an outlier. This appears to be an outlier, and these appear to be outliers. I'm not going to remove them. I'm just going to acknowledge them. But it does look like they're going down. R squared of 0.5 is relatively meaningful. It's not the biggest R squared in the world, but I think it's enough to draw a conclusion here. It's also enough. People's Party, I think, is pretty safe to say they're on an upward swing. They were probably flatlined prior to January 24th, it seems. That's when they started gaining ground. And if we look here, January 24th is kind of when the Conservatives lost a bunch of ground. Coincidence? Again, I don't think so. The Conservative R squared is clearly negative in the model, and it would be even more negative if we cut off everything before like December 17th, or even if we took it from the highest point at December 10th, though that would not necessarily be very statistically valid. I'm not going to do that though, because at only 3 updates, so I think this is actually 4 weeks. This downward trend seems to have existed for about 4 weeks. I don't want to re-access the graph because I don't know how permanent this could be. In the long term, this could just be an outlier blip, because support could still rally back to the Conservatives. There's no good, strong reason why one weird decision should permanently lose them support. If Aaron O'Toole runs a good campaign, we will see. It could very well start looking like this liberal graph here, which is just utter chaos with dots everywhere because apparently the pollsters cannot consistently poll the liberals. Everyone else is pretty consistently polling. NDP, Green, Bloc, they're all 0.04. Probably doesn't mean anything. If you actually look at the dots too, this looks like it's skewed because of 2 outliers down here, and if you remove these 2 outliers, it's probably flat. Green is too chaotic. There's technically a trend here, but it's only because the last 2 points have had the Greens do quite well. If the next 2 points are doing quite bad, it's going to go the other way. You can pretty much tell that since the variance in a lot of these points is way more significant than the supposed change over time, that this doesn't mean anything at all. This is a meaningless graph. A pretty similar story with the Bloc. Like, even if you remove some of these outliers, it's at best a flatline graph if you remove the most egregious outliers. And if you don't remove the most egregious outliers, then you're left with, what, this is 6.8 and 7.1. Like, a 0.3 spread when you're talking about a weekly rate of change of 0.003. Very unlikely that means anything. So, overall, that's the update. So, if you had a good week, I hope you have a good future week, and I hope you liked the video. If you liked it, please like, share, subscribe below. Comment. I like comments. They're pretty nice to read unless you're going to be rude. In which case, post it anyways. I'll take your rude feedback. Otherwise, have a good day, everybody.